Chapter 7 The Missing Route Chart. I slept in silk long enough to begin hating it and woke to ship bells. Not the lazy morning pulse of departure prep. Not meal call. Alarm. 3 quick strikes, a pause, then 3 more, low enough not to panic the whole harbor and urgent enough to pull every breath upright in my chest. For one stupid moment I forgot where I was. Then the cabin ceiling of the Lumina came into view. Pale wood ribbing curved overhead, the round port window still dark blue with pre-dawn. The silk coverlet over me belonged to the ship, but the scent of the ballroom still clung faintly to my hair and skin powder. Winter lily borrowed grace. I had come aboard after midnight half dead with tiredness, been helped out of the silver blue gown by a silent attendant who pretended not to notice my hands shaking, and fallen into bed while the route lines still shimmered behind my eyelids. Now the bells were ringing and the ship had teeth again. I threw off the coverlet, dragged on the first practical clothes I could reach, and jammed my feet into boots without bothering to lace them properly. My hair had partly come loose in sleep. Good. Let the morning deal with me as I was. The corridor outside already carried running footsteps and clipped voices. A crewman nearly collided with me at the stair bend, caught himself on the rail, and saluted by reflex when he recognized me. That alone told me the bells were serious. Men do not remember courtesy while sprinting unless they have been frightened into very fine habits. What happened? I asked. Storage lock breach, miss, he said. Captain's got the lower archive sealed. My stomach dropped hard enough to hurt. The lower archive. The Lumina carried many store compartments, provisions, spare rigging, sealed lamp crystals, replacement fittings, medical crates, noble luggage, scholar trunks no one touched unless they wished to die by annotation. The lower archive was different. Not a public library shelf for polite minds. It was where the ship kept route packets, old survey copies, sealed chart tubes, and the restricted materials Marcus did not trust to ordinary cabinets. The crewman was already moving again before I could ask more. I followed the alarm. The lower archive deck lay beneath the central chart corridor, reachable by a narrow stair and one reinforced hatch Marcus had once described, with some affection, as proof that paranoia deserved good hinges. By the time I got there, the passage was blocked by 2 guards, one ship quartermaster, Felix in yesterday's formal coat thrown over a shirt he had definitely buttoned wrong, and Marcus himself standing just inside the open hatch with a sort of stillness that meant rage had gone cold enough to become useful. He looked at me once and did not tell me to leave. That was new. Inside, the archive room had been opened like a wound. The first thing I noticed was not the missing charts. It was what had not been touched. Shelves of standard route packets still stood in clean order along the left wall. Recent Merchant Lane surveys lay stacked by chain, their wax tabs neat and undisturbed. 3 locked tubes containing current military approach lines remained in their rack, the seals unbroken. A drawer of night transit logs sat half-bowled and abandoned, but the books inside had not been taken. Even the emergency harbor schematics, valuable to the wrong sort of thief and useless to most honest men, still lay where they should. Only the old materials on the back shelf had been disturbed. Chart cases stood open there, some emptied, some left behind. A long vellum roll had been unwrapped and dropped carelessly across the sorting table. Several labeled tie cords lay cut on the floor. Not random theft. Selection. Felix saw me looking and pushed one hand back through his already ruined hair. They took only the early route era copies. Which ones? I asked. That, Marcus said, is what we're determining. He stepped aside enough to let me in. The quartermaster shut the hatch behind me once I crossed the threshold, sealing the room's cold lantern air and paper dust around us. Julian stood near the far wall. He had dressed faster than court etiquette recommended and slower than true rest would have required. Dark travel shirt, sleeves only half-fastened, hair not yet fully disciplined, fatigue still shadowing the line beneath his eyes. He looked as if the night had yielded him perhaps 2 hours of poor sleep and an argument with dawn. Yet his attention, when it came to the room, was knife clean. And when it shifted to me, just for a heartbeat, something in him eased. "You should have been told more gently," he said. The bells did not offer details. A flicker moved at the corner of his mouth and vanished. Not humor. Recognition. Marcus held out a cut tie cord with 2 gloved fingers. "We found the breech at first watch change. Outer hatch sealed. Inner lock picked cleanly. No forced hinge. No missing common routes. Only the older charts related to decommissioned outer lines and pre-reform station maps." "The Glassmere station," I said. Felix spread both hands. "Exactly. Not proof, not yet. But enough to make the skin along my arms go tight. The route station under Glassmere's cliff had been opened less than a day. Its record course still lived. We had returned to the capital, been dragged through councils and silk and old contempt, and before dawn someone had gone into the Lumina's restricted archive and taken only the charts that mattered to that buried system. Not fear of accidents. Pursuit. Who had access? I asked. Marcus's face might have been carved from a dark hull plate. Crew assigned to archive watch, myself, His Highness, Felix under supervision, 2 record clerks from the Palace Transfer Office, and 1 route inspector cleared during yesterday's council evidence intake. Felix said flatly, "I want the route inspector skinned." Marcus did not disagree loudly enough for courtesy. Julian looked at the shelves again. "And everyone knows Glassmere stabilized. Half the capital knows the West Line steadied," Marcus said. "Far fewer know why. Fewer still should know what was found under the cliff." Felix muttered, "That has never stopped offices from growing ears through walls." I moved toward the back shelf. The disturbance there had a shape I recognized before I knew why. Not because I had ever robbed a route archive, thankfully. Because workrooms tell you things about hands. A person who rummages out of panic leaves one sort of disorder. A person choosing under time pressure leaves another. Here, the ties had been cut too neatly to be frantic. The discarded cases were not all nearest the missing space. Someone had unwrapped deep shelf materials first and then flung a few outer ones loose afterward, as if trying to make the whole area look more chaotically searched than it truly had been. A mess built for witnesses. I crouched by the lowest case. Its tie cord had been sliced close to the knot, not torn. Fine blade, narrow edge. The vellum inside remained untouched because it was a later Freightline duplicate, too new to matter to whoever came here. Beside it lay a second case whose contents had been removed entirely. The label strip on the casing read in faded ink, "Outer Chain Survey, Pre-Reform Copy Roman 4" below that, almost rubbed off. Supplemental drift notes, restricted. Felix saw me reading and came closer. "That one's gone." "How many total?" I asked. 4 confirmed missing. Possibly 5 if one of the early fragment bundles was stored in the wrong sleeve. He rubbed at his eyes. "They took the Old West chain harmonizer overlays, an obsolete station sequence packet, at least 1 pre-reform drift survey, and the outer edge comparative." "The outer edge comparative," I repeated. Julian stepped nearer. "What does that include?" Felix blew out a breath. "Fragments. Speculative routes. Drift island notations. Most of it dismissed as incomplete before the reform offices standardized the line maps." My pulse beat harder. Outer edge. Drift island. The words sat wrong in my chest, as if they belonged to something waiting further out than Glassmere. Not enough to understand. Enough to fear. Marcus had begun with the crew. He questioned the archive watchman first, a broad-shouldered sailor named Perrin whose offense seemed to be honest humiliation. Perrin had checked the outer hatch at midnight, again at second glass, and found no breach. He had stepped away once only, for less than 4 minutes, to assist a sick steward in the corridor outside the medical stores because the steward insisted he could not breathe. When Perrin returned, the hatch still showed sealed. "A sick steward," Marcus said. Perrin flushed. "Yes, Captain." "Name?" Steward Lyle. Marcus turned to the quartermaster. Find him. The quartermaster vanished at once. A second crewman had seen a lamp moving on the lower stair just before watch change, but assumed it was one of the route clerks working late over transfer indexing. The route clerks, when hauled from their beds and made gray-faced with shock, insisted they had left the archives hours earlier after logging the Glassmere evidence box and that neither had gone below again. Everyone had a tidy account. Too tidy. And through it all I could feel the shape of the ballroom still clinging to me like stale powder. Oren on the terrace speaking of blood and stability. Vivienne's eyes hardening not at me but at the ugliness of it. Julian saying he would not let them make me invisible. Now, before sunrise, someone had moved against the evidence itself. My anger came back cleaner than the hurt had been. Good. Anger sharpens the eye. Marcus finished questioning the second clerk and came back to the chart shelf. His Highness asked that no one be named guilty before proof. Felix made an offended sound. How disappointingly civilized. Julian ignored him. And Marcus looked at me, then at the cut cords. And Miss Belrose is staring at the room as if it has said something rude. It has, I said. That got Julian's full attention. I held up the sliced tie cord. This part is staged. Felix leaned in instantly. How? The wrong things are messy. I pointed. See these outer cases? They were thrown open after the thief took what mattered. If you were searching in ignorance, you'd disturb the front first and go deeper. Here the deep labels were chosen cleanly, then later materials were cut or dropped to make the shelf look ransacked. Marcus folded his arms, meaning the thief knew exactly what they wanted. Yes. Felix crouched beside me, studying the order of the cases with sudden fierce stillness. She's right. Julian said, what else? I stood and turned slowly through the archive room. Lantern on the sorting table, open case, dropped vellum, cut ties, floor scuffs, the picked lock. The hatch closed after use. A false mess over a precise selection. My gaze moved to the table where one long vellum roll had been left half open. Its edge had been weighed down by a brass divider. A smear marked the surface near the bottom left corner, dark against the pale vellum. Not ink, oil or dirt. I went to it. Marcus followed close enough that I could feel his attention over my shoulder without the weight of interference. That too was new. Earlier in the voyage he would have looked ready to drag me back from any surface more ancient than a dinner tray. Now he watched as if trying to understand the angle of my noticing. I bent over the vellum and inhaled once. There, faint but distinct. Not winter lily, not floral resin, not any workshop scent of mine. Sharper, drier. A preservation oil, almost medicinal beneath the sweetness, meant to protect fine old materials from brittle air and skin salt. The same family of scent as the treated pry hook from Glassmere's wall seam, but cleaner, more expensive, less dock and more office. Do you smell it? I asked. Felix came close, frowned, then made a face. Bitter leaf. Marcus's gaze sharpened. With silver cedar. Julian looked from one of us to the other. What does that mean? Felix straightened. Archive preservative. Marcus said, not common ship issue. Route office handling oil. I looked up. Used on old vellum? And on official chart gloves, Marcus said. Rarely. Expensive. Overused by clerks who want the room to know they touch important paper. A small vicious satisfaction moved through me. There it was. Not a dock hand's sweat wrap. Not a random crewman's palm. Route office scent again, cleaner than the one from the pry hook but close enough to belong to the same world of hands. Felix pointed at the smear. Then either someone from the office touched this table after the transfer, or someone wants us to think so. Marcus's expression did not change, which usually meant it had grown worse. If they wanted us to think so, they would have done a cleaner job. Julian's eyes moved to the open hatch, then back to the shelves. So this theft was prepared. No, I said. All three looked at me. It was prepared, I said more slowly, but not calmly. Whoever did it knew what charts mattered. They also knew enough to fake disorder. But they cut one tie too close to the knot and another too long, and they dropped the wrong vellum open on the table. I touched the edge of the untouched freight duplicate. This one should have gone back into its sleeve if the thief had time. They left it because something interrupted them. Perrin returning, Marcus said. Maybe, I said. Or they were forced to move sooner than planned. Felix's eyes lit with unpleasant enthusiasm. So we have a competent thief having an imperfect minute. Beautiful, Marcus said. Try speaking like a man with blood. That seems a wholly unnecessary standard for intellect. The quartermaster returned with Steward Lyle 2 minutes later. Lyle looked properly miserable, which on its own meant little. People summoned before Marcus often achieved proper misery very quickly. He swore he had been ill, that he had barely made it down the corridor before vomiting in the wash bucket near the medical stores, that Perrin had only steadied him and fetched water. The medical matron confirmed someone had indeed been sick there. So either Lyle was innocent or someone had made use of his body as distraction without bothering to ask permission. Marcus had the bucket checked anyway. That was the sort of man he was. While the questioning continued, I moved to the archive lock. The inner mechanism had been opened without damage. Felix had already muttered over the pins and called the work disgustingly competent, which was likely the highest praise he could pay a crime before breakfast. I ran my fingers lightly over the metal edge without touching the key mouth. No burr, no pry marks, no forced spring. Proper key or clean pick. But just below the lock plate, on the painted wood of the hatch frame, a tiny crescent scrape had been darkened with finger oil as if someone had tried to rub it away. I knelt. The scrape sat at the height of a metal badge or seal clip brushing the frame during entry. Not a boot mark. Not a tool strike. Something worn at the hip or hanging from a belt. Ship crew on the Lumina wore soft practical belts with tucked tools, nothing polished enough to leave that sort of neat curved line unless a hook bounced loose. Palace route officials, on the other hand, loved badges. Small, self-important, and always positioned to catch on furniture they did not move enough themselves to respect. Marcus, I said. He came without impatience. What? I pointed. He crouched, saw the scrape, and touched the edge without quite making contact. Metal clip. Badge or seal ring, I said. Something rigid. Felix bent nearly double to see past us. The route inspector. Maybe, Marcus said. Maybe one of the transfer clerks. Julian looked to the quartermaster. Were badges recorded at entry? The man's silence answered before his mouth did. Marcus rose. Then they will be now. The first push of suspicion spread from there. Not openly, not with names shouted down the corridor. In harder little ripples. Crew glances shifting toward the palace transfer staff. Palace transfer staff going pale and offended enough to suggest low-deck tampering. One of the route clerks, young, nervous, and eager to defend his own neck, looked straight at me and said, "The old charts matter only because of the Western Station. Few outside this ship even know what was found there." The room cooled. I felt every eye turn, measure, hesitate. There it was. Not a full accusation. Something subtler and more poisonous. The workshop girl had been at Glassmere. The workshop girl understood the old weaves. The workshop girl had reason to value the missing materials and no proper place in ship hierarchies where access should have been granted. All the ingredients for polite suspicion. Julian spoke before I could. "Choose your next sentence carefully," he said. The clerk lost what color remained to him. I should have let Julian's rebuke stand. Instead, I heard my own voice answer, very clear and very tired. "If I wanted those charts for myself, I would not have bothered leaving your clerk work intact." The young man swallowed and looked down. Marcus, infuriatingly, did not dismiss the point as beneath notice. He only looked at me with that hard, unreadable focus of his and said, "And why not?" Because he was testing whether I could answer pressure without flailing. Because he already half knew and wanted the room to hear me say it. Because he was cruel in useful ways. Because I know the difference between materials that matter and materials thrown loose to imitate panic, I said. And because if I meant to steal station charts, I would not cut the shelf ties with a neat blade and then smear expensive archive oil over a decoy vellum. I let my gaze pass over the clerk and back to Marcus. This room was arranged by someone who understands old route documents but not craft habits. They made a mess the way officials imagine workers make messes. No one breathed for a beat. Felix made a quiet, delighted sound that probably meant he wished to write that sentence down and frame it over a desk. Marcus's mouth did not move, but his eyes changed. Respect from him never arrived prettily. It came like a bar being moved from one side of a doorway to the other. "Continue," he said. I turned back to the shelf. If someone had chosen only the relevant early charts, then what remained might tell us what they deemed worth leaving behind. I began reading the surviving labels one by one. Northern Auxiliary Line revisions. Western Freight Sequence duplicate. Obsolete ballast notations. Comparative harbor depth tables. A partial route song index whose title made Felix hiss like a kicked scholar because he had apparently not known the Lumina carried such a thing at all. Then I saw the torn case. It lay wedged behind the outer edge slot, half hidden by a displaced tube. Empty. The vellum inside had been removed hastily enough to rip the label strip down one side. A fragment of the inner map sheet still clung under the retaining rib where the thief had not pulled cleanly. I worked it free with the tip of my nail. A triangle of old vellum came loose, no larger than 2 fingers put together, brittle at one corner and marked in faded silver-blue ink. Not much. Enough. Felix was over my shoulder before I fully unfolded it. "Careful. I know how vellum behaves," I said. "That has never stopped vellum from behaving badly." I ignored him and turned the fragment to the lantern light. A curved route line crossed the piece, thinner than current major lanes. At its edge sat the partial outline of an island mark drawn not as a settled berth circle but as an irregular floating shape. Beside it, nearly cut off by the tier, remained 3 words in old survey hand. Drifting isle below that, half an annotation mark. Felix's breath hitched. Outer drift chart. Julian stepped nearer. A drifting isle. Felix took the fragment only when I let him. A category, not a single named island. Floating landforms that lost primary route anchor ages ago and moved beyond regular chain maps. Most later offices treated them as legend, hazard, or marginal salvage not worth funding. Marcus said, "Yet someone took the chart." "Yes," I said. And because they took it, the phrase stopped sounding like legend and started sounding like destination. The room had narrowed around the fragment now. Even the nervous clerk who had looked at me earlier had forgotten his own terror long enough to stare at the torn words with open hunger. Marcus took control of that at once. "No one speaks of this outside the archive." Felix said, "That order is already late." Marcus's gaze cut to him. "Then be earlier next time." Julian was studying the torn slot from which the fragment had come. "If they removed the outer drift comparative, why leave this piece?" "Not left," I said. I pointed to the retaining rib. "It snagged." He looked at the torn edge, then at me. "And that means they were in a hurry." "Yes." Marcus crossed to the sorting table, or interrupted before they could inspect what tore free. I followed him with my eyes and saw what he had seen. On the far side of the table, near the brass divider holding down the decoy vellum, lay a curl of sealing thread too fine for common chart wraps. Blue-black, waxed and flattened on one end where something heavier had pressed over it. Marcus picked it up with the point of a knife. Felix frowned. That wasn't from the shelf ties. No, Marcus said. The thread had been used not for binding the map cases on the shelf, they were plain service cord, but for sealing transfer satchels and official document wraps. I knew because the palace clerks yesterday had handled our Glassmere station notes in packets tied with exactly that sort of too fine seriousness. Thread meant to imply care, rank, and the importance of not touching what one did not own. Marcus held it under the lantern. There, on the flattened end, clung the smallest smear of blue wax. Calais, who had been near useless since dawn but still understood enough to fear symbols, muttered, "Route office courier rap." No one answered him. I walked to the open hatch and looked out into the corridor. The archive room sat off the lower chart passage. From here, a thief leaving in haste had two practical choices. Back up the main stair toward ship quarters, where crew traffic at watch change risked witness, or along the service passage toward the starboard cargo latch, used mainly during transfer loading when the Lumina berthed under palace supervision. Yesterday, after the midnight return from the palace, the Lumina had still been tied to the upper harbor for evidence intake and ceremonial resupply. Official couriers had come and gone. Route inspectors, transfer clerks, palace archivists with two clean hands. The sort of people no watchman stops if their badge shines hard enough and their tone implies inconvenience at being delayed. "Marcus," I said. He joined me. "If you had the charts in a transfer satchel and wanted off the ship fast, would you take the main stair?" "No. Too many eyes." "Yes." I looked down the service passage. Then the cargo latch. Felix followed, clutching the torn fragment like a relic. "That opens into the upper harbor transfer lane, which at this hour connects directly to the administrative bridge," Julian said. Marcus's face went still again, toward the route office quarter. There it was. Not proof enough for arrest, more than enough for direction. The thief had known which old maps mattered. They had staged common disorder badly, used or carried route office preservative oil, likely worn an official metal clip, wrapped materials in courier thread, and chosen the service line leading toward the administrative zone rather than risk the crew stairs. The torn fragment they failed to notice pointed toward drifting outer aisles, the sort of notation current offices called obsolete until suddenly it became dangerous to let others read it. Felix looked down at the fragment again, then toward the still dark port window at the end of the corridor as if he could already see beyond the capital, beyond the western chains, to some unmoored island drifting at the edge of old routes and old lies. Julian turned to Marcus. "Seal the service latch records. Track every official transfer packet that left the Lumina after second council adjournment." Quietly, Marcus nodded once. "Already started." "Good." Julian's gaze shifted to me. I stood there in an unlaced boot, yesterday's tiredness still in my bones, ballroom powder likely still clinging somewhere useless beneath my ears, and the hurt from the terrace now burnt down into something leaner and more useful. I had been looked over, dressed up, cut cleanly by politics, and then nearly turned into a point of suspicion before sunrise. I should have felt fragile. Instead, I felt awake. He saw that too. I knew he did from the way his expression changed, not with relief alone, but with the wary respect he always showed when I reached the harder version of myself instead of retreating. "You found the thread of it," he said quietly. No one else in the corridor would have understood how much those words mattered to me. Not praise for bravery, not comfort, trust in the way I worked. I looked past him, toward the service passage leading to the harbor bridge and beyond that to the white stone quarter where Oran Vale Court's offices sat above route ledgers and polished seals. "They're ahead of us now," I said. Marcus corrected me at once. "Trying to be." The captain's tone had changed too. Not soft. Never that. But the suspicion he had once kept like a blade angled toward me had turned outward. I had crossed some line in his estimation during the storm, and crossed another just now in the archive room. He no longer looked at me as a hazard the prince had brought aboard. He looked at me as part of the hunt. Good. The ship bells above shifted into departure sequence, low and steady. Outside the archive corridor, dawn had finally begun staining the capital sky with the first gray of morning. The torn fragment in Felix's hand showed only 3 surviving words and half a route line. It was enough to tilt the whole voyage toward the outer dark. Chapter 8. We waited for dawn in the storm tower by noon. The stolen charts had already changed our course. The Lumina should have sailed under full escort, proper route permissions, and enough palace objections to choke an ordinary crew. Instead, Marcus had us away from the upper harbor before half the court finished its second round of breakfast outrage. He used one of the smaller royal cutters for speed, stripped the passenger list down to what he called necessity and what Felix called cruelty, and cut west under a sky that had no intention of staying honest. Necessary, it turned out, meant 6 people. Marcus, Julian, Felix, 2 deckhands who knew how to handle a fast cutter in bad current, and me. The official explanation, if anyone asked, was outer route verification linked to the Glassmere packet. The real explanation sat folded in Felix's inner coat pocket in the shape of a torn vellum fragment that said just enough to make every silence around it dangerous. Drifting Isle. That scrap, plus 1 surviving reference from a route song index no one should have left on the Lumina's archive shelf, pointed not directly to the drifting isle itself but to an older observation tower beyond the western chains. An old sky-watching post. Pre-reform, half-forgotten, no current ceremonial value. Exactly the sort of place the kingdom neglected until it needed an answer hidden there. By the time we cleared the capital ring, the weather had already soured. At first it was only a pressure shift in the air, the kind sailors notice before land-borne passengers do. The sky had gone from pale spring blue to a strained hard silver. Wind currents that should have run clean along the outer approaches crossed at ugly angles instead, pressing cold through the cutter's rail screens and making the sailcloth twitch before full gusts ever hit. Even the route line under us looked wrong by daylight standards, too faint one moment, too bright the next, as if something beyond the visible range kept dragging at it. I stood near the starboard rail with one hand wrapped around the support line and the other hooked under the strap of my satchel, trying to ignore the memory of the ballroom's reflected stars still trapped somewhere in my body. I had changed before boarding practical boots, travel skirt, dark-fitted coat, hair tied back badly and left to survive on its own terms. I had thought stripping off silk would strip off the ache with it. It had not. What had passed with Oren on the terrace still sat under my ribs like a blade left in after the cut. Blood. Great houses. Stability. Not said to wound, and therefore wounding perfectly. I hated how often, since then, my mind returned to the exact moment I withdrew my hand from Julian's arm. Not because the act itself mattered to anyone else. Because I had felt the loss of it before I had even fully chosen it. Wind hit the cutter broadside. The hull rocked hard. One of the deckhands swore and corrected the trim. Felix, seated at the chart box with 3 packets open at once and no respect at all for the motion, looked up only when the jolt threatened his ink. "If you fall overboard before we reach the tower," he said, "I should like it recorded that I warned everyone the day was already too inconvenient." "I would hate to interrupt your notes with drowning," I said. Julian stood opposite us near the forward mast brace, one hand resting on the line with the balance of someone born to ships and routes and skies that shifted beneath him. He had slept little, if at all, since the archive breach. The fatigue showed more on this smaller vessel than it had on the Lumina, where command and deck size gave him more room to wear distance. Here he was close enough for me to see the strain at the edge of his mouth each time the cutter crossed a rough current seam. He should have been in bed. He was on a fast cutter headed straight for outer weather because someone had stolen old charts under his own ship's guard and because sitting still while others moved pieces around him had never been a skill he cultivated. Marcus stood at the helm with both gloved hands fixed on the steering ring as if he trusted neither the wind nor the rest of creation. "Report," he said without turning. Felix dug the torn fragment from his inner pocket and flattened it against the chart board with 2 fingers. The surviving route song index reference places a sky observatory on the western boundary watch line. If the missing drift comparative included correction notes, they were likely copied from the tower ceiling charts or the lower transit logs. Assuming those are still there, Marcus said, and if they aren't? Then we have enjoyed an unnecessary amount of wind for nothing. One of the deck hands muttered, comforting. I looked past Felix to the spread charts. Current west chain routes crossed the parchment in neat office-approved silver. The older overlay beneath them, one Marcus had reluctantly allowed open because we no longer had the luxury of treating old things politely, showed thinner lines and more branching marks. Some ended in notes like half-remembered warnings. Some had been crossed out by later hands. One far outer curl had only a faded symbol beside it and a irregular island outline, no berth seal, no freight code. Floating. Unfixed. Not a proper place to live if one believed every valuable thing needed an office and a tax. Julian caught me staring. What is it? That mark, I said, pointing. The irregular island. Why leave it on later copies at all if the line was discarded? Felix glanced up. Because route men are cowards and romantics in equal measure. We strike out what we do not fund and keep the ghost on the edge in case it decides to become relevant while we aren't looking. Marcus said flatly, you call everyone a coward eventually. Only the living ones. The cutter rose sharply over a current swell and came down harder than before. This time Julian's hand tightened on the brace line fast enough to show pain before composure covered it again. I saw, and because I saw, some older unease in me stirred. Not all the way to fear. Not yet. A memory of Glassmere's station and the way his face had gone pale when the old lines woke beneath us. A memory of the harbor flare, of the storm edge scraping the luminous path, of how he carried route strained like something both inside and outside his body. The sky ahead darkened another degree. West Glass fell behind us first, then the lesser western islands, until the world narrowed to broken route line, the cutter's silvered wake, and a horizon bruised into gunmetal at the edges. Far to port, something large moved through cloud shadow, one of the high skyfish that rode lower currents in bad weather, its body visible only when lightning far beyond the cloud bank flashed pale through the mist. Even fantasy looked colder out there. Marcus signaled the deck hands to reef the side cloth. You expect it to hit before the tower? Julian asked. Marcus did not waste words. Yes. Felix said the outer charts suggested only crosswind distortion. The outer charts were stolen, Marcus replied. I trust what the sky is doing now. That shut everyone up. The first visible sign of the storm came 10 minutes later. Ahead of us, where the route line should have thinned and bent toward the boundary watch lane, a long black-silver smear moved across the air as though a piece of night had been dragged into day and stretched wrong. It did not behave like cloud. Cloud gathers, breaks, swells, and drifts. This thing fed. Every time the faint route shimmer beneath it flashed, a strip of the light vanished into the dark and did not return. The sight turned the back of my mouth dry. One of the deck hands said, very softly, Star Eater. The words needed no more volume. Julian had gone still in the particular way I now recognized too quickly. Stillness not from calm, from impact held inward. The fingers on his right hand flexed once and then closed harder around the line. Marcus saw without looking directly. Talk to me. Julian drew a measured breath. The western boundary route is tearing along its edge. Marcus's jaw tightened. How close? Closer than I'd like. Felix looked up at the dark smear, then at the thin route glimmer beneath it, and lost color. If it bites through the watch line before we reach the tower, then we dock half a miracle earlier than planned, Marcus said. Hold your papers. The cutter leapt forward under trimmed sail. The tower appeared first as a needle of darker gray against the storm bank. No ornament. No welcoming lantern array. Just a narrow stone spire built on a cliff-borne outcropping little wider than a warehouse roof, joined to the last stable rock shelf by a suspended chain bridge and an old mooring arm that had not seen royal maintenance in years. It rose alone at the edge of the world we still pretended to map. A watcher's place, not built to comfort those inside it. "Can we make the mooring?" I asked. Marcus glanced once at the angle of the wind, once at the tower, once at the eating dark behind it. "We make something." The next gust slammed us hard enough that the cutter's outer rail screamed. Felix clutched the chartboard to his chest like a child protecting scripture. The deckhands moved with brute focus, hauling lines, resetting trim, forcing the small vessel into the narrow angle between storm pull and rockward drift. The route shimmer under us flashed once, twice, then vanished entirely for a terrifying 3 count before returning in ragged strips. Julian shut his eyes. Only for a breath. That was all. When he opened them again, there was pain in them he had not managed to hide fully. My stomach clenched. Marcus shouted for dock hooks. The tower loomed suddenly huge. Up close its age showed in every seam. The outer stone was streaked dark by years of weather. Metal bands around the upper observation chamber had greened in places. Half the crystal panes near the top had gone milk-white with salt and wind wear. The mooring arm jutted from the rock shelf beneath it like a broken spear, still intact enough to catch one sideline if the sky took pity. The sky did not. We came in too fast on the first angle, swerved by a cross-current, and almost lost the docking line to the storm smear dragging over the watch lane. Marcus corrected hard. The cutter clipped the mooring arm with a scrape that shook my teeth and sent sparks off worn metal. One deckhand caught the outer hook on the second try. "Move," Marcus barked. Now. There was no graceful disembarkation after that. Julian took the chartboard from Felix because Felix had both hands full of panic and paper. Marcus threw me a line and told me to clip it to my belt ring. The wind hit so hard the moment we crossed the rail gap to the rock shelf that it felt as if the storm had hands and objected personally to our survival. The bridge between shelf and tower was chains and planks and old bad ideas. Not collapsed. Worse. Still technically functional. Rain began all at once, not full rain, not clean water. Needled spray carried ahead of the storm front, cold enough to sting exposed skin and slick enough to turn every board underfoot treacherous. The world narrowed to the bridge, the hammering wind, and the tower door 15 paces away. Marcus sent one deckhand first, then me, then Felix, then Julian, keeping himself and the last man behind to catch anyone the bridge tried to throw off. I hated every step. The planks bucked under the gusts, chain rails jerking in our hands like living things. Below us there was no water to fall into, only air and lower cloud and the distant suggestion of black rock far beneath. By the time I reached the tower threshold, my boots were slick, my face was wet, and I had no more dignity left to lose. Julian came through the door 2 breaths after me with the chartboard lashed under one arm and his coat darkened nearly black by the spray. Marcus slammed the tower door on the storm with both hands and dropped the iron bar into place just as the first real strike of wind hit the outer wall. The whole tower shuddered. Inside, darkness and old stone swallowed us. For a moment all I could hear was breath. Mine. Felix's. The crew. Julian's, too controlled to be ordinary. Marcus lit the wall lantern nearest the door with a steady hand that should have belonged to a calmer world. The entry chamber of the tower was plain and circular, built for endurance rather than beauty. Hook racks on one wall, old weather cloaks hanging stiff and useless with age, a rusted signal lever locked in the down position, storage bins for line and flare powder, all half empty now. A narrow stair wound upward around the inner core toward the observation chamber above. Another, steeper stair dropped below into what was probably the furnace room and lower records vault. Rain hammered the outer stone. Wind screamed in the narrow high slits. The lantern flame bent and recovered. Marcus turned to the crewman. Lower furnace. If it still draws, I want heat in this tower before dark. Second lanterns lit. Secure the door brace again after the vent check. To Felix, you go nowhere alone. To Julian, upper chamber only after the furnace catches. Julian had begun to answer. The tower shook under another gust before he could. His hand shot out to the wall. It was small, the sort of motion anyone else might have missed while shaking water from sleeves and catching breath after the bridge. I saw it. So did Marcus, from the way his eyes hardened. The storm is already on the watch line, Julian said. The words came level. The hand on stone did not. Marcus swore under his breath. Below first. Now. The captain did not wait for consent. He moved us all toward the lower stair because heat was suddenly more than comfort. Felix argued exactly once about the upper records and got told, with admirable simplicity, that dead scholars catalog poorly. The furnace room smelled of ash, old iron, and damp neglect. It sat below the entry chamber under a low arched ceiling, half workshop and half storm hold, with a stone fire basin on one side and vent channels climbing inside the walls toward the upper observatory. The first deckhand cleared the grate, while the second unpacked dry starter blocks from the cutter's emergency kit. Someone in the tower's past had designed the place to keep a handful of watchers alive through bad nights. I found myself grateful to them with unreasonable force. We shed what we could. Outer cloaks first, dripping onto the stone. Gloves. Wet over sleeves. Felix complained when Marcus told him to take off his soaked coat until Julian, pale and silent beside the furnace, removed his own without a word. That ended the matter. I unbuttoned my travel coat with fingers gone clumsy from cold and laid it over an old rail to steam. My undersleeves were damp through. My skirt hem had taken the bridge spray almost to the knee. When I pushed back loose strands of hair, my hand came away wet. The fire caught badly, then better. Dry fuel bit, then cracked, and at last a real flame built in the basin. Warmth spread slowly, stubborn and smoky at first, then with more confidence as the vent took. The relief in the room was nearly shameful. Felix hung over the charts to check for water damage. Marcus sent one crewman back up to confirm the upper chamber windows were still shuttered against direct wind. The other stayed at the furnace to coax more heat from old coal and royal kindling. No one said we had been lucky. We all knew it. I wrung water from the hem of my skirt into the drain channel and looked up in time to see Julian turn away from the fire too quickly. He made it as far as the far wall before he bent one hand against the stone and stopped moving. Pain is strange when the person feeling it has trained all his life not to show it. It does not vanish. It leaks in other ways. The line of the shoulders becomes too controlled. The breath goes shallow between the ribs. The hand braced against the wall does not press for balance exactly, but for argument with whatever is inside the body and refusing to behave. Marcus saw. So did I. Felix, for once, kept his mouth shut. Sit, Marcus said. Julian did not turn around. In a moment, Marcus took one step forward. I moved before he could. Not because Marcus meant harm, because there are moments when too much authority around pain turns it instantly into a battle. Julian did not need a battle with his own captain while the storm chewed at the watch line outside. I'll bring him tea, I said. Marcus stopped. A strange pause held the room. Then he gave one short nod. There are victories smaller than a bow and weightier than one. I carried that nod with me to the hot water kettle. By the time I crossed the room with a tin cup warm enough to burn my fingers, Julian had straightened again. He was facing outward now, toward one of the narrow vent slits where nothing could be seen except darkening weather. His face had gone almost colorless in the shifting firelight. I held out the cup. He looked at it, then at me. You did not have to rescue me from Marcus. He had the expression of a man preparing to wrestle a prince into a chair. That does sound like him. His voice was almost steady. Almost. I waited until he took the cup. The hand that closed around it was not quite as steady as his voice. What does it feel like? I asked quietly. He might have lied. In the palace he would have. On a deck under crew eyes, probably. Here, in an old storm tower with fire smoke in the air and wet coats steaming from hooks, something in him seemed too tired for polished evasions. He looked down at the cup, like standing inside a bell while someone strikes the metal from the outside, he said after a moment. The nearer the broken line, the louder it becomes. Smaller disturbances are only discomfort. Storm-fed tears are. He searched for the word and did not find one he liked. Disorienting. I thought of the harbor. The lumina near the storm edge. Glassmere Station waking under our hands. And the old stations? He lifted his gaze. Firelight moved across his eyes. They hurt less than the damage does. That answer sat heavily in me. Because it meant what I suspected, the older route system, the one shared with the Star Weavers, did not tear at him the way the brute distortions did. Its answers fit. Its misuses hurt. He had been born into a kingdom using half a broken instrument and calling the noise inevitable. You've had this all your life, I said. Yes. The simplicity of it made me want to set something on fire that was not already meant for the furnace. Julian leaned one shoulder lightly against the wall as if he had spent years learning exactly how much weariness he could show without inviting interference. As a child they called it sensitivity, which is a kind way of saying the court did not know whether to praise it as proof of the royal line or treat it as an inconvenience in formal clothes. I stared at him. There are moments when compassion arrives so quickly it almost feels like anger. This was one. You were a child, I said. A shadow crossed his face. Not surprise. Something sadder. Yes. The cup in his hand sent up thin steam. Outside, the storm hit the tower in a long screaming gust and the vent slit sang briefly with it. Julian's jaw tightened hard enough to show. Without thinking, I reached for his free hand. He looked at me. Sit, I said. You have grown commanding. Only because you are being unreasonable at speed. A breath of laughter escaped him despite the pain. It was small and tired and so heartbreakingly real that I had to look away for a second or risk doing something reckless. He let me lead him to the low bench nearest the fire. No one in the room pretended not to notice. Marcus, to his immense credit, only turned his attention to the furnace draw and barked at Felix about water stains on the chart margin. The two deckhands kept to the far side of the room with the tact of men who had seen stranger things in worse weather and knew better than to make trouble of them. Julian sat. The firelight showed what the dimmer room had hidden. The rout strain had hollowed his face around the eyes. His mouth was set too tightly. One of his hands still flexed now and then against his knee as if feeling for a rhythm the storm kept stealing. I knelt to ready my boots properly because it gave me a reason to stay near without looking like a clinging fool. The tower matters to the rout, he said after a while. Felix looked up at once. How much? Julian listened rather than answered immediately. That by itself told me the effort of feeling had become work. It sits near one of the outer braids feeding the old boundary line. Not the grand route itself. A branch that once read its movement. He took another slow breath. Something in the storm is dragging across the branch at irregular intervals. The tower still remembers how to watch it. The grand route. There it was, the larger thing at the edge of our journey, half spoken so far, more threat than map. The old central line beyond the common arteries, the great silver road the kingdom had once lived by and now touched only through broken instruments and inherited pain. Felix crouched by the chart board, suddenly alight again despite the weather. If the tower still reads the outer braid, the ceiling map may retain pre-reform correction paths. Marcus said, which is why no one touches the upper chamber until the storm stops trying to kill us. It isn't trying to kill us, Felix said. We are simply poorly timed. Marcus stared at him. Felix reconsidered. Fine. It is trying somewhat. The first hour of shelter passed in practical work. The crew got the second fire basket lit in the upper stairwell to drive chill from the stone. Marcus checked the shutters, the lower record alcove, the tower bridge brace, and the signal arm in case a retreat became possible. Felix dried chart fragments by the furnace with the manic devotion of a man preserving scripture after flood. I rebuilt what I could of myself from damp cloth, a comb, and stubbornness. Julian drank the tea and let another cup be pressed into his hand without argument, which by then I understood as a concession to the storm and not to weakness. Night came early in the tower. The storm bank swallowed the late sky so completely that the transition from afternoon to dark felt less like evening and more like being covered. The window slits lost what little color they had held and became black seams in the wall. Wind hammered the shutters in irregular beats. Once, somewhere outside and above, route light flashed through the cracks in pale silver bars and vanished instantly. By then the worst of the damp had steamed out of our outer clothes. My travel coat hung by the fire rail, still dark in patches but wearable again. My hair had dried in uneven waves around the nape of my neck where the tie had loosened. Felix had fallen into the strange trance scholars enter when weather, danger, and discovery give them too much nourishment at once. He sat cross-legged on the floor with the torn drift fragment, the surviving route song index line, and 2 blank sheets, building speculative overlays by lantern light and muttering rude things about modern cartography. Marcus took first watch near the upper stair and refused every suggestion that he sit. At some point the crewman on the far side of the room dozed against a coil of line with his chin on his chest. The other remained awake only because he feared Marcus more than sleep. Julian and I ended up in the upper chamber alone. Not fully alone. Nothing so convenient. Marcus had the stair. Felix hovered below in the lower room with his maps. Yet the observatory above felt separate from them all, a pocket of cold stone and old sky suspended over the storm. We had come up because the ceiling needed to be seen once the first sequence of weather passed. The upper chamber was circular, wider than the lower furnace room and much finer. 3 high shutters opened inward over narrow crystal slits, though only one could be risked by a hand's width because of the wind. The walls held worn instrument niches and bronze armatures where once, perhaps, charting lenses had swung. The center of the floor was inlaid with a 12-ring star dial over which dust had gathered only lightly. Above us the ceiling arched into a painted map of the sky. Not decorative stars. Routes. I saw that at once and the breath left me. Silver lines crossed the ceiling in layered curves, some bold, some nearly erased by time. Island marks floated among them like constellations redesigned by people who cared about landing points more than myth. 4-point stars marked major junctions. Smaller petal-like emblems ringed the outer edge where observation notations once sat. Between the lines ran faint painted bands that at first looked like ornament until I realized they moved in repeating rhythms, narrow and wide, short and long, a sequence carried around the dome as if the ceiling itself held music. The lullaby. Not the notes, not directly. The pattern beneath the notes. Breath lengths. Pause turns. The same structure my mother had hummed while her hands crossed silver under flowers. I stepped under the center of the dome and tipped my head back until my neck protested. Julian came to stand beside me. He had shed his damp outer coat earlier and now wore only the dark shirt with the sleeves rolled once, exposing forearms tensed more than rest required. The firelight from below reached us in thin upward pulses, not enough to warm the chamber properly, but enough to catch in his hair and along the line of his cheek. The ceiling sings the same way, I said softly. He looked up. What do you mean? I traced one repeating painted band in the air. The pauses. The pattern of the route marks. not decoration. Timing. I swallowed. My mother's lullaby sits like this. It breathes like this. Julian's gaze returned to the dome, and I saw the moment understanding touched him. Not full understanding. Enough to know the thread I heard was not imagined. The storm struck again, this time closer. The whole tower rang. Not shook, rang. Stone and metal together, taking the hit of some route-fed surge outside and throwing the sound through the chamber in a low, violent tone. Julian went white under the lantern glow and staggered half a step. I caught his arm. He did not try to shake me off. That frightened me more than refusal would have. Julian. His breath went sharp between his teeth. One hand pressed hard against the wall as if he needed the tower's spine to borrow from. I had seen him in pain now several times. This was the first time he let himself be held in it. It's closer, he said. The storm, the braid. He shut his eyes. The outer braid is crossing too near the damaged line. The words made little sense to me in technical form. They made perfect sense in the way that mattered. Something in the weather was scraping directly against whatever part of the route he carried. I moved him toward the stone bench built under one of the narrow window slits. This time there was no argument at all. He sat heavily enough that my own fear sharpened to a clean edge. I knelt in front of him because the bench was too high to do anything else. The chamber was cold. Wind hissed through the cracked shutter seam. My fingers had long since stopped caring about propriety, so I took both his hands and held them until the trembling in them lessened by a degree. "It will pass," I said. He opened his eyes. There are looks that belong to people who have forgotten how to ask for comfort without feeling they have failed at something. He gave me one of those, and it nearly split me open. "I know," he said. "That isn't what I meant." His mouth moved, not quite a smile. "No." The storm groaned against the tower again, less violently this time. I could hear Marcus on the stair below speaking to Felix in a harsh whisper, both of them pretending not to listen for what happened above. Let them pretend. "You should have told me sooner," I said. "I tell very few people." That was not wise. It was often useful. I wanted to scold him. Instead, I tightened my grip on his hands. They had warmed a little from mine, or perhaps I only wanted to believe that. He looked down at our joined hands as if the sight puzzled him. "When the route turns wrong," he said after a moment, "the body tries to follow it. That is the best description I know. Balance stops meaning what it should. Sound becomes direction and not direction at once. Near severe breaks, it feels as though the world is asking me to stand in places that do not exist." The image hit me hard enough to leave bruises. No wonder he sometimes went still before bad lines. No wonder he hated the brute-forced systems. No wonder he could stand in a ballroom full of people and still seem lonelier than he should have been allowed to become. I thought of him as a boy. A child trained to carry royal grace while invisible pain threaded through every broken route. A court deciding whether to praise or conceal that pain depending on what version of the crown they needed that season. Something hot and bitter climbed my throat. "Was there no one?" I asked. He understood the question at once. "Not like this. Not like this." No one who held his hands while the storm rang through the tower. No one who looked at him as a man first and symbol after. No one who answered the route pain with anger on his behalf rather than reverence for its political usefulness. I should have been more careful after that realization. Instead, I reached up and touched my fingers lightly to his face, just once, to the cold line beside his temple where strain had pulled the skin tight. "You don't have to hide it from me," I said. The silence after that was not empty. His eyes closed. Not fully. Enough. He turned just slightly into my hand before catching himself, and that tiny involuntary motion told me more than any confession could have. Trust, yes. Weariness, certainly. Something else too. Something gentler and more dangerous than either. When he spoke, his voice had gone low enough that the storm almost covered it. With you, he said, it grows quieter. I forgot how to breathe. Not because the words were polished. They were not. He said them like a fact discovered too late to soften. That made them far worse for my heart. I drew my hand back before I did something foolish and impossible to survive afterward. The movement seemed to wake the chamber. From the bench, I saw it first only as a pale flicker overhead. The painted lines in the dome, those old route bands and rhythm marks, caught the lantern light wrong. No, not wrong. Answered it. I stood too quickly and nearly struck my head on the lower arch beam. The ceiling, I said. Julian pushed up from the bench at once, despite the lingering pallor in him. I would have ordered him still if I thought it would work. It would not. The silver lines on the dome were glowing. Not all of them. A scattered sequence at first, then another, tracing a path between one 4-point star and a second farther west. The painted rhythm band between them brightened in alternating lengths. Short, long, short pause. Long, long, turn. The exact breathing structure of the lullaby's second phrase. I did not remember deciding to do it. I took the little floral circlet I had made that evening from the satchel hanging at my side. During the long storm wait, with my hands needing work to keep from shaking and the old silver loop no longer fit for secrecy alone, I had wound fresh wind blooms through it from the tower's dry herb stores, small pale flowers kept once for watcher rituals or scent masking, still usable after all these years. It was not a grand crown, only a narrow circlet, white and silver, and made because my hands know no other way to think when frightened. Now it felt warm. I stepped into the center of the observatory dial. The glow overhead sharpened. Julian said my name, quietly, but he did not stop me. I lifted the circlet toward the ceiling. The dome answered in silver. Lines spread in widening arcs, joining one old route mark to another, until the whole upper chamber breathed with the rhythm of hidden paths. The painted sequence bands no longer looked decorative at all. They were notations, timing instructions, song lengths translated into sky roads. My mother's lullaby was not only a lullaby. It was a route key. A final burst of light ran across the western half of the dome and gathered at the outer rim above the narrow slit window. There, half hidden under years of smoke stain, a cluster of tiny island marks flared one after another until only one remained bright. Not fixed on any current chart, not ringed as settled land, drawn as an irregular shape drifting beyond the mapped boundary line. The drifting isle. Felix thundered up the stair the moment the light reached full brightness, Marcus just behind him, both too late to pretend patience and too early to hide hope. Felix stopped dead under the dome. Oh, that one syllable held enough awe to serve an entire cathedral. Marcus took in the glowing path, the lit island mark, the circlet in my lifted hand, Julian still too pale by the bench, and me standing under the observatory center like someone the tower itself had chosen to inconvenience specifically. He did not waste time on Marvel. "Can you keep it?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. Julian moved to my side. The moment he did, the final route line between the observatory and the island mark brightened into full clarity. Felix made a sound I can only describe as scholarly blasphemy. Marcus looked at both of us, then at the dome. Apparently that helps. Below the glowing island symbol, a line of old notation appeared along the painted band, faint at first and then clean enough for Felix to lunge at the nearest writing slate. He read aloud as he copied, voice shaking. Beyond the broken west braid erected at dawn under paired light drift line takes song, not command. He looked up at us, wild and white-faced and alive with understanding. "It's not just direction," he said. "It's timing. The tower is showing when the drift line becomes safe enough to cross." "Dawn," I said. Felix nodded fiercely. "Yes. At first light, when the storm pull weakens along the outer braid." Marcus was already calculating distance, supply, weather, and risk in the silence after. Julian watched the dome for another long heartbeat, then looked at me. The storm had not passed fully. It still moved outside in great dark breaths around the tower. But the pain in his face had eased. Not vanished. Eased. Perhaps because the route path overhead had stopped being torn noise and become answer again. Perhaps because now, at last, the next step had shape. The drifting isle no longer felt like rumor at the edge of a stolen fragment. It had become road. The light overhead held, steady and cold and beautiful. Dawn had not yet arrived, but the tower had already begun counting toward it.